I forgot my name on the third day, though I cannot be certain it was truly the third day, because time loses all meaning in the underhive, where the Emperor's light reaches only as propaganda broadcasts, echoing through rusted Vox speakers, mounted on walls that weep. Condensation like the tears of abandoned saints. The designation they gave me, UH74429 Zeta, still burns in my mind, branded there by repetition and the dull ache of identity slowly dissolving like synthetic protein wafers in recycled water. I remember being someone once, having a mother whose face has become a blur of generic features that could belong to any of the billions pressed into the lower levels of the hive city. Her voice, a ghost frequency lost among the constant grinding of machinery that never sleeps, never pauses, never acknowledges the existence of those it consumes in its eternal hunger for productivity. The hab block where I spent my early years stretched 17 floors downward into darkness so complete that the lumens on the lowest levels had been cannibalized decades before I was born, their absence as natural as the absence of hope in the eyes of workers, shuffling to their shifts in the Prometheum refineries, 6 kilometers deeper into the hive's bowels. Our compartment, I cannot bring myself to call it a home, measured 3 meters by 4, a space we shared with 7 others whose names I also cannot recall, though I remember the sound of their breathing in the darkness, the smell of their bodies pressed close together for warmth when the heating ducts failed during the cold cycles. The walls bore the stains of previous occupants, rust-colored patches that might have been blood or might have been corrosion, the ambiguity somehow more disturbing than certainty would have been. My mother worked in the textile manufactorum on sub-level 43, her shifts lasting 16 hours by Imperial standard measurement, though she often stayed longer when quotas fell short, knowing that failure to meet production targets resulted in reduced ration allocations or worse, the attention of the administratum overseers who walked the factory floors with shock moles hanging from their belts like holy relics of discipline and order. She would return to our compartment, with her hands trembling from operating the weaving machines, her fingers marked by dozens of tiny cuts from the synthetic fibers that carried toxins which accumulated in her bloodstream with every passing year. I remember how she would pray before sleeping, whispering litanies to the God Emperor with a fervor that seemed desperate even to my young mind, as though she believed that sufficient devotion might somehow transmute our existence into something bearable, might convince the distant throne on Far Terra that we mattered, that our suffering served some greater purpose in the vast machinery of the Imperium. The other adults in our compartment worked various shifts in the underhive's endless industrial complexes, the Prometheum processing plants, the sewage reclamation facilities, the corpse starch, rendering plants that fed the hive's teeming billions with protein slurry manufactured from the dead who nobody claimed or missed. One man, whose scarred face suggested a past encounter with industrial equipment, worked in the forges where adamantium plating was shaped for the void ships constructed in the orbital dockyards we would never see. He would return from his shifts with his skin blackened by soot, the smell of burning metal clinging to him like a second skin, and he would cough throughout the night, his lungs slowly filling with the particulates that the recycled air systems could not fully scrub away. I was 7 years old by Imperial reckoning when the administratum scribes came to our hab block with their data slates and servo skulls, conducting the census that occurred every 5 years, with bureaucratic precision that cared nothing for the disruption it caused to lives already precarious. They moved through the corridors with armed enforcers flanking them, the enforcers' shotguns held ready as though they expected resistance from malnourished workers and their hollow-eyed children. The scribes recorded our designations, our health status, our work assignments, and our projected utility to the hive's productive capacity, all while maintaining expressions of such profound indifference that it seemed they had trained themselves to view us not as human beings, but as components in a vast machine requiring periodic inventory. When they reached our compartment, one of the scribes, a woman whose augmetic eye whirred and clicked, as it focused on each of us in turn, noted that I had reached the age of labor assignment. She consulted her data slate, her mechadendrites twitching with minute adjustments as information scrolled across the screen too quickly for me to read. She pronounced that I was to report to the Juvenile Labor Conscription Center on sub-level 60 within 3 days, where I would undergo assessment and assignment to whichever industrial facility required additional workers for tasks unsuitable for adult laborers due to size constraints or expendability considerations. My mother made no protest, offered no plea for exception or mercy. She simply nodded her understanding, her face blank with the resignation of someone who had long ago learned that resistance to the Imperium's edicts was not merely futile but actively dangerous. After the scribes departed, trailing their servo skulls and enforcers behind them, like a procession of mechanical vultures and their armed attendants, she held me close for the first time I could remember, her embrace both desperate and fleeting, as though she knew this might be the last moment of tenderness I would experience before the underhive consumed me completely. The Juvenile Labor Conscription Center occupied a massive chamber carved from the hive's bedrock, its ceiling lost in shadows 3 stories above the ferrocrete floor, where hundreds of children stood in lines marked by painted numbers that had faded to near illegibility over decades of use. The air tasted of machine oil and fear, an acrid combination that settled on my tongue like a toxic benediction. Servo skulls drifted overhead, their empty eye sockets glowing with recording equipment that documented every moment of the processing for records that would be filed in archives nobody would ever read. The whispers of the other children created a susurration like wind through corroded ventilation shafts, each voice carrying variations on the same theme of confusion and dread. Overseers in the grey robes of administratum functionaries directed us through a series of stations where we underwent physical examinations conducted with the detached efficiency of tech priests evaluating machine components. They measured our height, our weight, our muscle density, our visual acuity, our dexterity, our lung capacity. They drew blood samples with needles that seemed unnecessarily large, filling vials that were labeled and filed without explanation. They scanned us with devices that hummed and clicked and whined, their purposes mysterious but their invasiveness undeniable. Throughout the process, none of the functionaries spoke to us directly, issuing instructions only through the vox speakers mounted at each station, their voices distorted into a metallic drone that stripped away any pretense of human connection. I was assigned to the chemical synthesis facility designated Manufactorum Theta 7, located on sub-level 72, 15 levels deeper than my family's hab block, 15 levels closer to the hive's foundation and the toxic aquifer that formed its lowest reaches. The facility produced industrial solvents used in the construction of machinery throughout the hive, its processes releasing fumes that the air recyclers struggled to contain and which left a bitter taste on everything they touched. My task, along with 40 other children pulled from that day's conscription, was to crawl through the narrow maintenance tunnels beneath the primary synthesis vats, clearing blockages in the drainage systems that carried away the toxic waste products of the manufacturing process. The tunnels were barely wide enough for a child's body, their walls slick with condensation and chemical residue that burned exposed skin on contact. We wore thin gloves and rebreathers that filtered some but not all of the fumes, the equipment issued to us clearly salvaged from previous users and maintained only to minimal functionality standards. The darkness in those tunnels was absolute whenever our hand lumens failed, which occurred frequently due to poor maintenance and the corrosive atmosphere that ate away at their circuitry. I learned to navigate by touch and sound, my fingers running along pipes that thrummed with the flow of chemicals while I listened for the gurgling that indicated a blockage requiring attention. The work shifts lasted 12 hours, though without natural light or reliable chronometers. Time became an elastic concept measured only by the ache in my muscles and the increasing difficulty of breathing through a rebreather whose filters clogged progressively throughout the shift. We were permitted 2 10-minute rest periods, during which we could ascend to the maintenance sub-level and remove our rebreathers long enough to consume nutrient paste dispensed from automated feeders that rationed our caloric intake with mathematical precision. The paste tasted of nothing, its texture somewhere between liquid and solid, as though the manufacturers had sought to create something that could be consumed without requiring the luxury of actual chewing. Accidents were common and unremarked. Children disappeared into the tunnels and did not emerge, their absence noted only when head counts revealed discrepancies that required replacement requisitions to be filed. Sometimes we would discover their bodies lodged in the drainage systems, their flesh already beginning to dissolve from exposure to the chemical waste, their faces frozen in expressions that suggested their final moments had not been peaceful. The overseers would direct us to extract the bodies and place them in the disposal chutes that fed the corpse starch rendering plants. Waste not, want not, as the administratum aphorisms insisted, every component of the Imperium's human resources utilized to maximum efficiency, even in death. I worked in those tunnels for what I believe was 3 years, though my memory of that period exists as a blur of darkness and chemical burns and the constant struggle to breathe through failing filtration systems. My body adapted to the environment in ways both necessary and horrifying. My skin developed a grayish pallor from lack of sunlight and continuous exposure to toxins. My lungs grew accustomed to functioning at reduced capacity. My sense of smell deadened, to the point where I could no longer distinguish between different types of chemical contamination. I grew taller but not stronger, my frame stretching without adding mass because our rations provided only enough nutrition to sustain basic functionality without permitting actual health. The other children in my work detail changed constantly as they were reassigned or disappeared or simply failed to report for their shifts one day and were never mentioned again. I learned not to form attachments, not to learn names or share stories of the lives we had left behind. We existed in a perpetual present tense, our pasts irrelevant and our futures unimaginable, nothing but the immediate reality of the next tunnel, the next blockage, the next shift that might or might not kill us. On what I later calculated was approximately my 10th birthday, though I had long since stopped tracking such meaningless markers of time's passage, I was transferred from the maintenance tunnels to the VAT monitoring station on the manufactorum floor. This represented a promotion of sorts, moving from the most dangerous work to tasks that merely risked severe injury rather than almost certain death. The VAT monitoring required me to stand on elevated platforms surrounding the massive synthesis chambers, watching the temperature gauges and pressure readouts and chemical composition indicators, ready to activate emergency venting systems if any parameter drifted outside acceptable ranges. The work was mentally numbing rather than physically taxing, requiring constant attention to instruments whose readings meant nothing to me beyond the threshold values I had been trained to recognize. The heat from the vats was intense. The air shimmering above their surfaces like reality itself was warping under the strain of the chemical reactions occurring within. The platforms where we stood were metal grills that grew scorching hot by the end of each shift, burning through the thin soles of our work boots to blister the skin of our feet. Below the grills, 30 meters down, the concrete floor of the manufactorum stretched between the massive foundations of the vat supports, that distance representing certain death for anyone who lost their balance or whose platform corroded through unexpectedly. The drone of the manufactorum's machinery created a soundscape of industrial monotony. The churning of pumps, moving chemicals through networks of pipes, the hiss of pressure releases, the grinding of mechanical stirrers within the vats, the distant clanging of metal on metal, where maintenance servitors worked to repair equipment that failed faster than replacements could be fabricated. Over this mechanical symphony, the Vox speakers broadcast prayers to the machine god and the god emperor in rotation, the litanies becoming a kind of audio wallpaper that penetrated consciousness only during the brief moments when the machinery fell silent for shift changes. My fellow monitor workers were a mixture of ages and origins, some having worked in the manufactorum for decades, their bodies twisted by the environment into shapes that seemed to mock the human form. One man, I never learned his designation, had developed growths across his shoulders and back, where chemical splashes had repeatedly scarred the same tissue, the new flesh forming in bulbous masses that he could no longer fully see or reach to clean. A woman working the monitors on the adjacent vat had lost most of her hair to caustic fumes. Her scalp, a patchwork of scar tissue and stubborn wisps of colorless strands. They spoke little, conserving energy for the concentration required to prevent catastrophic failures that would kill not only ourselves, but potentially hundreds of others working in the manufactorum's various sections. The overseers who supervised our work patrolled the catwalks between the vats, their augmetic enhancements marking them as having earned sufficient favor with the administratum to warrant mechanical improvements to their failing biological components. Some had replaced their eyes with targeting optics that could spot gauge deviations from distances too great for unaugmented vision. Others had traded their legs for mechanical assemblies that never tired, allowing them to patrol continuously throughout their shifts. I watched them with a mixture of envy and revulsion, understanding that their augmentations represented both privilege and dehumanization, each mechanical component bringing them closer to the mechanicus ideal, while simultaneously distancing them from whatever humanity they had once possessed. During my 12th year in the manufactorum, I was either 22 or 23 years old by then, the uncertainty stemming from gaps in my memory of the early years, an explosion in synthesis, VAT 9 killed, 17 workers, and injured dozens more. The blast resulted from a pressure buildup that the monitor on duty failed to notice until the emergency venting system could not release the excess quickly enough. The vat ruptured with sufficient force to spray boiling chemicals across 2 adjacent platforms and into the monitoring station below, the caustic liquid eating through metal and flesh with equal efficiency. I was working 3 vats away when the explosion occurred, the shock wave strong enough to knock me off my feet and against the railing of my platform. Through the smoke and steam that filled the manufactorum floor, I could see figures writhing on the platforms near the ruptured vat, their bodies dissolving as the chemicals consumed them from the outside in, their screams briefly audible above the chaos of alarms and automated emergency responses before shock or death silenced them. The emergency servitors responded with mechanical precision, their programming optimized for containment rather than rescue, sealing off the affected area with blast shutters, while those who were not yet dead pounded uselessly against the metal barriers. The manufactorum continued operating throughout the cleanup process, production quotas permitting no interruption even for disaster response. We worked our remaining shifts, breathing air thick with the smell of burned chemicals and rendered human fat, the ventilation systems struggling to clear the contamination while continuing to process the fumes from the active vats. Replacement workers arrived within 2 hours of the explosion, fresh conscripts who had completed their training and now filled the gaps left by the dead with the same indifferent efficiency that characterized all imperial bureaucracy. No memorial service was held for those who died. No moment of silence was observed. The administratum scribes processed the casualty reports and filed the appropriate documentation for corpse starch reclamation and dependent notification, each death reduced to a series of data entries in records that would be stored in archives until the hive's eventual collapse or humanity's extinction, whichever came first. The servo skulls that monitored our work added the incident to their recordings, their documentation, comprehensive and utterly devoid of compassion, perfect observers, for a system that viewed its workers as consumable resources to be expended in service to production goals that served purposes none of us understood. After the explosion, I began to notice details I had previously ignored or accepted as normal. I saw how the overseer's augmetic eyes tracked us with the same mechanical precision they used to monitor the VAT gauges, analyzing our efficiency and productivity with algorithms that reduced us to performance metrics. I noticed how the maintenance servitors moved through the manufactorum with more care than the human workers, their programming valuing the machinery they serviced above the people who operated it. I recognized that the prayers broadcast through the Vox speakers served less to inspire devotion than to fill the silence with noise that prevented thought or conversation, keeping us isolated within our individual experiences even as we worked in crowds. The realization of my expendability should have been devastating, but I found it strangely liberating. If I had no value beyond my immediate utility, then I also had no obligation beyond basic survival. The Imperium's grand narrative about service and duty and the God Emperor's divine plan became transparent as propaganda, empty words meant to justify an exploitative system that ground human lives into productivity statistics. I continued working my shifts with the same outward compliance, but internally I had withdrawn my consent, refusing to internalize the ideology that demanded I sacrifice myself willingly for masters who would never know my name or care about my death. This mental rebellion remained private and undetectable, my thoughts, my own, in a world where everything else had been claimed by the Imperium's insatiable appetite for control and exploitation. I found small ways to resist that would never be noticed, working just slowly enough to miss the highest productivity bonuses without triggering disciplinary action, allowing gauge readings to drift slightly beyond optimal ranges without reaching dangerous thresholds, failing to report minor equipment malfunctions that would require someone else to work extra hours repairing them. These acts of sabotage accomplished nothing meaningful, changed nothing about the system or my place within it, but they preserved something within me that I could not quite name, but recognized as essential to whatever remained of my humanity. When I was approximately 25 years old, I was selected for transfer to a different work detail based on criteria I was not informed of and could not predict. The selection process was administered by administratum representatives who conducted interviews that felt more like interrogations, their questions probing aspects of my background and capabilities that seemed irrelevant to any industrial work assignment. They asked about my family history, my medical status, my education such as it was, my psychological resilience, my views on the Imperium and the God Emperor's dominion. I answered carefully, understanding that incorrect responses might result in punishment, while also recognizing that the questioning itself suggested some purpose beyond routine worker reassignment. The transfer order came 3 days after the interview, delivered by servo skull to the manufactorum floor during my shift. I was instructed to report to an address on sub-level 37, 15 levels higher than my current posting and 40 levels above my family's hab block, into regions of the hive I had never accessed and had no authorization to enter. The order provided no explanation for the transfer, no indication of what work awaited me at the new location, only coordinates and a reporting time that gave me barely enough margin to make the transit through the hive's labyrinthine passages. I never returned to the hab block where my mother might still have been living. The thought of attempting to find her, of trying to say goodbye, or simply to see her one final time, occurred to me during the transit to my new assignment, but I dismissed it as both logistically impossible and emotionally dangerous. If she was still alive, still working her shifts in the textile manufactorum, still praying to the God Emperor with desperate fervor, then she existed in a reality separate from my own, and any attempt to bridge that gap would serve only to remind us both of everything the Imperium had stolen from us. Better to let that connection remain severed, to preserve the memory without contaminating it with the reality of what we had both become. The facility at sub-level 37 occupied a converted industrial complex that had been repurposed for reasons that became clear only gradually through accumulated observation. The entrance was guarded by armed soldiers wearing the uniform of the Astra Militarum, their lasguns held with the casual readiness of troops accustomed to violence and authorized to employ it without hesitation. They checked my transfer order against their data slates, their faces showing neither welcome nor hostility, only the professional disinterest of soldiers following their orders with mechanical precision. Inside the facility, the atmosphere differed markedly from the manufactorum. The air was cleaner, filtered through systems that actually functioned properly, rather than simply redistributing contamination. The lighting was brighter, approaching the illumination levels described in technical manuals as suitable for human visual function. The walls had been painted within recent years, their surfaces mostly free of the rust stains and water damage that characterized every other space I had inhabited. The contrast was so stark that it felt unnatural, as though I had been transferred to a different world rather than simply moving between levels of the same hive city. I was directed to a processing station, where functionaries issued me new clothing, actual garments, rather than the ragged work uniforms I had worn in the manufactorum, fabric that showed no signs of previous use or chemical damage. They provided bathing facilities with water that was almost clean and soap that actually produced lather. Luxuries so unexpected that I struggled to accept them as real rather than some elaborate psychological test. After cleaning away years of accumulated grime and chemical residue, I looked at my reflection in a polished metal panel and barely recognized the person staring back, my features having matured into adult proportions without my conscious awareness, my eyes carrying an emptiness that no amount of washing could cleanse. The work assignment, when I finally received it, proved both confusing and horrifying in ways I lacked the context to fully understand at first. I was to serve as a subject in Medicaid testing protocols, my role consisting primarily of existing within monitored environments, while medical personnel administered various compounds and observed the results. The functionary who explained this to me spoke in clinical terminology that obscured the reality of what I was being asked to do, his words painting a picture of valuable service to the Imperium's medical knowledge, while carefully avoiding any mention of risk or permanent damage. The testing facility occupied 3 sub-levels within the complex, its chambers arranged around a central monitoring station where servitors and human technicians observed us through one-way glass and recorded data on equipment whose purpose I could only guess at. We were housed in cells that were called residential units but functioned as prisons, their doors controlled remotely and their privacy non-existent, given the monitoring equipment that tracked our every movement. There were approximately 200 other subjects in the facility when I arrived, their ages ranging from children younger than I had been when I entered the manufactorum to elderly individuals whose presence suggested they had survived long enough to be useful for studying long-term effects. The tests began simply enough with blood draws and tissue samples, invasive, but not particularly painful beyond the immediate discomfort of needles and scalpels. The medical personnel who administered these procedures worked with practiced efficiency, their movements suggesting extensive experience in extracting biological materials from uncooperative subjects. They spoke to each other in medical cant I could not follow, their conversations treating us as interesting specimens rather than suffering human beings, their tone neither cruel nor kind, but rather professionally detached in ways that felt more disturbing than outright malice would have been. After the initial assessment period, the testing progressed to pharmaceutical trials. We were administered compounds through various vectors, pills we were required to swallow while being observed, injections that left our arms bruised and aching, transdermal patches that were affixed to our skin and monitored for absorption rates. The effects varied wildly depending on the specific compound being tested. Some produced only mild nausea or headaches that faded within hours. Others caused violent physical reactions, uncontrollable tremors, projectile vomiting, muscle spasms so severe they left us writhing on the floor of our cells, while the monitoring equipment faithfully recorded every moment of our suffering. The medical personnel documented everything with meticulous care, their data slates constantly updating with our vital signs and symptomatic responses. They seemed neither pleased nor displeased by our suffering, treating our pain as merely another data point to be recorded and analyzed. When subjects died during testing and deaths occurred with alarming regularity, the bodies were removed promptly and efficiently, new subjects arriving within days to maintain the facility's operational capacity. I understood then what I was, understood the true purpose of this facility with its clean air and bright lighting and remotely controlled cell doors. We were test subjects, human analogues for whatever compounds the Imperium's Medicae divisions were developing, our lives measured solely by our utility in absorbing toxins and demonstrating side effects that could then be mitigated before the compounds were deployed for more valuable personnel. One compound they administered in my 3rd month at the facility produced hallucinations so vivid I could not distinguish them from reality. I spent 6 days trapped in a nightmare landscape where the walls of my cell breathed and bled, where servo skulls spoke in my mother's voice telling me I had always been worthless, where the God Emperor himself manifested as a corpse thing of such profound decay that his very presence felt like annihilation given form. The medical personnel watched through their one-way glass and documented my breakdown with clinical precision, their notes probably describing my screaming and self-harm attempts in language that reduced horror to symptomatology. When the compound cleared my system and the hallucinations finally ceased, I found myself covered in bruises and lacerations from where I had thrown myself against the walls, the medical team having apparently decided that intervening would contaminate their data. Between testing sessions, we were allowed to interact in a common area under constant surveillance. The other subjects were a cross-section of the hive's forgotten population criminals, who had been given the choice between execution and testing participation, homeless individuals conscripted from the depths, workers who had suffered injuries that made them unsuitable for continued industrial employment, and children who had been designated as suitable subjects for reasons nobody explained. We spoke little, our shared experiences creating a bond of mutual recognition rather than friendship, each of us understanding that the person we talked to today might be dead tomorrow, their absence noted only as a gap in the subject roster requiring replacement. One woman, her designation long since forgotten by both of us, had been in the facility for 7 years, an impossibly long survival time that she attributed to pure chance rather than any particular resilience. Her body bore the cumulative marks of hundreds of tests, scars from surgical procedures, discolored patches where compounds had been applied topically, tremors that never fully ceased from neurological damage that had partially healed. She spoke in whispers about the worst tests, the ones that left subjects changed in ways that made death seem preferable. She described a man who had been administered a compound that caused his bones to grow continuously, his skeleton deforming and breaking through his skin in places before the medical personnel finally euthanized him. She told of a child whose skin had begun excreting an acidic substance that dissolved anything it touched, the girl spending her final days restrained in a sealed chamber while doctors observed through reinforced viewing ports. I asked her once why she continued to cooperate, why she didn't simply refuse the tests, or attempt escape or force the guards to kill her. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and answered that hope died slowly, that even in this place there were moments between tests when the pain faded and you could almost convince yourself that tomorrow might be different, that the next compound might be harmless, that somehow you might survive long enough to reach an end to your usefulness and be released. She knew this was delusion, knew that nobody left the testing facility except in disposal bags bound for the corpse starch plants. But the delusion was all that remained when everything else had been stripped away. The testing continued through cycles I measured not in days or weeks but in the rhythm of pain and recovery, suffering and respite. Some compounds affected perception of time itself, stretching minutes into eternities or compressing hours into instants. Others attacked specific organ systems, kidneys failing and then recovering, hearts developing arrhythmias that required emergency intervention, lungs filling with fluid that had to be drained through procedures performed without anesthesia because sedation would interfere with data collection. The medical personnel treated each crisis with the same professional efficiency, stabilizing subjects who were dying too quickly while allowing others to decline at rates that permitted maximum data gathering. I began to dissociate from my body, viewing it as separate from my consciousness, a piece of meat that housed my awareness but did not define it. This psychological defense mechanism allowed me to endure procedures that would have otherwise shattered my sanity, the insertion of monitoring devices into my abdomen, the repeated biopsies of various tissues, the experimental surgeries where they tested new techniques on subjects whose survival was considered optional. I would retreat into my mind during these procedures, finding refuge in memories that grew increasingly distant and unreliable as the compounds I was administered interfered with my brain chemistry and cognitive function. My memory began to fragment, events occurring without clear chronological order, my personal history becoming a collection of disconnected moments rather than a coherent narrative. I could not remember which tests I had already endured and which were yet to come. Names and faces blurred together. The passage of time became meaningless beyond the immediate present. I existed in an eternal, now punctuated by periods of suffering that seemed to have neither beginning nor end, my consciousness floating in a sea of pharmaceutical alteration and monitored pain. There were moments of clarity between the fog of drugs and trauma, instants when my mind achieved something approaching normal function, and I could recognize the full horror of my situation. During these moments, I understood that I would die in this facility, that my body would be reduced to data points and disposal statistics, that nobody would remember my name or mourn my passing. The Imperium's vast machinery would continue grinding forward without pause, without acknowledgement that I had ever existed. My life would be counted only in the successful compounds developed using my suffering as proof of concept, my death justified by whatever marginal improvements those compounds provided to military personnel or administratum functionaries, or any of the billions whose lives the Imperium deemed more valuable than mine. This understanding did not comfort me, but neither did it increase my despair beyond what had already become my baseline state. I had moved beyond hope or fear into a territory of simple endurance, continuing to exist because the biological imperatives that drove my body forward remained functional, even as my will to survive had eroded to nothing. I ate when food was provided because hunger was uncomfortable. I slept when exhaustion overwhelmed me because consciousness had become unbearable. I submitted to the tests because resistance was impossible and would only add physical punishment to the pharmaceutical torment I already endured. The facility administrators maintained a facade of care, providing medical treatment for conditions the tests themselves had caused, ensuring subjects remained functional long enough to yield useful data. They managed infection risks with antibiotics, treated malnutrition with vitamin supplements, splinted broken bones and stitched lacerations. This maintenance was performed with the same efficiency as servitor repairs. Human bodies treated as biological machinery, requiring upkeep to remain productive. The medical personnel who administered this care showed no more emotional investment than tech priests maintaining equipment, their ministrations neither kind nor cruel, but simply functional. I witnessed other subjects break under the cumulative weight of repeated testing, their minds fragmenting in ways that no pharmaceutical intervention could repair. One man began speaking in tongues, his words a stream of nonsense syllables that might have been prophecy or madness. the distinction irrelevant to the medical staff, who simply noted this as a side effect and continued their work. A woman became catatonic, her body still functioning, but her consciousness having retreated to some place unreachable, her eyes staring at nothing, while the tests continued on her unresponsive flesh. A child regressed to infancy, losing language and motor coordination, reduced to helpless mewling, that the medical personnel found annoying but not concerning enough to justify euthanasia, while the subject remained biologically viable. I felt myself approaching similar breakdowns multiple times, my mind straining against the accumulated trauma and pharmaceutical corruption of my brain chemistry. There were days when I could not remember how to speak, my thoughts refusing to translate into words. There were periods when my sense of self dissolved completely, my consciousness dispersing into fragments that observed my body from multiple perspectives simultaneously, each fragment convinced it was the real me, while the others were imposters or hallucinations. The medical staff documented these episodes with particular interest, their data slates recording my psychological deterioration as enthusiastically as they had recorded my physical suffering. What saved me, if salvation is even the correct term for mere continued existence, was the bureaucratic error that ended my time in the testing facility. An administratum scribe conducting a routine audit discovered that my conscription order had expired, that I had been held beyond my authorized testing period due to paperwork that had been filed incorrectly or lost in the massive archives where such documentation slowly decomposed alongside the hopes and aspirations of everyone Imperium had ever catalogued. The scribe, motivated not by compassion, but by the desire to correct discrepancies that might reflect poorly on their departmental efficiency ratings, ordered my immediate release and transfer to standard labor conscription pools. The medical personnel protested this interruption to their ongoing studies, arguing that I represented valuable longitudinal data and that my premature removal would compromise multiple research protocols. The scribe remained unmoved, citing regulations that gave bureaucratic compliance precedence over research convenience, their mechanical application of rules protecting me where human mercy never would have. I was processed out of the testing facility within 3 hours of the scribe's visit, my accumulated medical documentation sealed and archived, while I was issued new work assignment orders and transported to a labor staging facility on sub-level 55. The labor staging facility served as a clearinghouse for workers awaiting assignment to whatever industrial complexes required additional personnel. We were housed in dormitories that held hundreds of bodies in tiered bunks, the air thick with the smell of unwashed humanity and the sound of coughing from lungs damaged by 1,000 different industrial processes. The facility provided minimal amenities, communal bathing facilities with frigid water, feeding stations dispensing nutrient paste, and Vox speakers broadcasting prayers and productivity quotas in endless rotation. We existed in limbo, no longer serving previous functions but not yet assigned to new exploitation, our temporary uselessness making us nearly invisible to the functionaries who administered the facility. I spent 17 days in the labor staging facility, my body slowly recovering from the pharmaceutical assault it had endured, while my mind struggled to process years of accumulated trauma without the fog of compounds clouding my thoughts. The clarity was almost worse than the confusion had been, allowing me to fully comprehend what had been done to me, what I had become, what little remained of the person I might have been. I found myself missing the dissociation that the test compounds had provided, the way they had allowed me to experience suffering at a remove. Sober consciousness meant feeling everything fully, meant acknowledging the permanent damage to my body and psyche, meant recognizing that I would carry the weight of those experiences until death finally released me. Other workers in the dormitory shared their own stories of Imperial service, their narratives forming a tapestry of suffering that varied in detail, but remained fundamentally identical in theme. A man who had lost 3 fingers in a manufactorum accident, A woman whose lungs had been scarred by toxic fumes in a chemical processing plant. An elderly individual whose decades of labor had left their spine curved and their hands twisted into arthritic claws. We were the Imperium's refuse, human waste products of a system that extracted utility until nothing valuable remained, then shuffled us between holding facilities, while bureaucrats determined whether we retained sufficient function to warrant continued exploitation. My new assignment came via servo-skull delivery. The skull's mechanical voice, reciting coordinates and reporting instructions with the same tonal quality it would have used to announce executions or weather forecasts. I was being transferred to a mining operation on sub-level, 90-20 levels deeper into the hive than I had ever descended, into regions where the rock itself wept, toxic groundwater, and the pressure of billions of tons of city above created an atmosphere of existential claustrophobia that drove some workers mad within days of arrival. The mining operation extracted trace elements from the hive's foundation, recovering precious metals and rare earth compounds that had been incorporated into the bedrock during the city's ancient construction. The work was performed by hand using primitive tools because the excavation sites were too unstable for heavy machinery, the risk of collapse requiring operations that could be abandoned instantly when the rock overhead began groaning with the sound of impending failure. We worked in teams of 5, our movements coordinated by whispered instructions and hand signals, because speaking too loudly might trigger vibrations sufficient to bring down the tunnels we were digging. The darkness in those depths was absolute beyond the range of our hand lumens, the blackness so complete it seemed solid, a physical presence pressing against our eyes. The air was thin and stale, filtered through systems that struggled to maintain breathable atmosphere at these depths, while removing the toxic gases that seeped from the rock. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, each drop carrying dissolved minerals that left crystalline residue on everything they touched, our equipment, our clothing, our skin. The temperature fluctuated between extremes. Scorching heat when we worked near thermal vents in the bedrock, and bone-aching cold when those vents were distant, our bodies never fully adapting to the rapidly changing conditions. Collapses occurred weekly, sometimes multiple times within a single shift. We would hear the groaning of stressed rock, the popping of support timbers beginning to fail, the grinding of stone plates shifting against each other, and we would abandon our tools and run for the main shaft, our hand lumens bouncing wildly as we sprinted through passages barely wide enough to permit our bodies. Sometimes we all made it out before the tunnel collapsed, gasping in the relatively cleaner air of the main excavation while servo skulls hovered overhead counting survivors. Other times, the collapse was too fast or too widespread, and some of our team would be caught in the rockfall, their bodies crushed or buried too deeply for recovery to be economical. The dead were listed as mining casualties in the administratum records, their designations noted alongside the date and location of their death, their remains left entombed in the collapsed tunnels, because excavating corpses required resources that could not be justified for workers whose productive capacity had ended. Their families, if they had any, would receive standardized notification letters, expressing the Imperium's appreciation for their loved one's sacrifice, and reminding them that grief was acceptable only if it did not interfere with their own work duties. The deceased's ration allocations would be terminated immediately, the system moving with impressive speed when it came to reclaiming resources from those no longer able to work. I worked in the mining operation for what I estimate was 4 years, though time measurement became even more unreliable in the depths where day and night held no meaning and shifts were determined by arbitrary scheduling rather than any natural cycle. My body adapted to the extreme conditions through changes that felt like deterioration. My vision becoming permanently damaged from the constant strain of working in near darkness, my hearing becoming hypersensitive to the sounds of rock stress, while losing the ability to process normal speech frequencies. My lungs developing a chronic wheeze from breathing stone dust, despite our filtration masks. The other miners were veterans of various industrial disasters or bureaucratic reassignments, their bodies marked by the accumulated damage of decades in the Imperium service. They spoke little, conserving breath for the physical exertion of mining, their communication reduced to essential warnings and instructions. I learned to read exhaustion in the set of their shoulders, to recognize the tremor that preceded heatstroke, to identify the distant look that meant someone was approaching the psychological breaking point and would either recover or need to be prevented from doing something that would endanger the entire team. There was no advancement in the mining operation, no path to better conditions or reduced danger. We were the bottom of the hive's hierarchy, literally and figuratively, workers whose continued existence served only to extract materials that would be refined and incorporated into products we would never see, contributing to projects whose purposes remained forever mysterious to those who provided the labor to accomplish them. The Imperium's grand narrative about service and duty rang hollow in the depths, replaced by the simple reality of physical survival, and the knowledge that today's suffering would be followed by tomorrow's identical suffering in an endless progression toward death. I stopped dreaming during this period, my sleep becoming a blank darkness that provided no respite or escape from waking reality. My mind had apparently decided that unconsciousness should be purely functional, a biological necessity, stripped of the psychological processing that dreams represented. I would close my eyes after a shift, and then open them again when it was time to return to the excavation, the intervening hours vanishing without trace or memory. This absence of dreams felt like a theft, a loss of some essential human capacity, but I lacked the energy or will to mourn what had been taken when so much else had already been stolen. The administratum eventually decided that the mining operation on sub-level 90 had extracted sufficient material to justify abandoning the site, the remaining deposits too diffuse to warrant continued exploitation given the casualty rates and equipment costs. We received notification of the site's closure via Vox announcement, the mechanical voice informing us that we would be reassigned to alternative labor details after completion of our current shift. The functionaries provided no explanation for this decision, no acknowledgement that we had spent years of our lives extracting value from rock that the Imperium now deemed insufficiently profitable to continue accessing. My new assignment returned me to the manufactorum levels, though not to the chemical synthesis facility where I had worked in my youth. Instead, I was assigned to a military equipment refurbishment center where damaged armor, weapons, and vehicles were repaired or salvaged for their component materials. The work involved sorting through material that had been returned from battlefields I could not imagine, equipment bearing damage from weapons I had never seen, stained with substances I could not identify, but recognized as probably being blood or worse. The refurbishment center operated with industrial efficiency, its processes designed to extract maximum value from material that had survived the soldiers who had worn or wielded it. My specific task involved cleaning equipment before it proceeded to the actual repair stations, removing organic material and environmental contamination so that tech priests and skilled workers could assess damage without wading through gore and filth. I worked with harsh chemical solvents and scrubbing tools, my hands protected by gloves that were replaced when they dissolved through rather than when they became uncomfortable to wear. The equipment told stories I could piece together from the patterns of damage and contamination. Armor pierced by projectiles that had punched through ceramite as though it were cloth, the entry holes small and clean, while the exit points suggested explosive expansion of whatever had been traveling through the metal and the body it protected. Weapons scorched by feedback from overheating, their barrels warped by excessive firing rates, their ammunition feeds clogged with substances that might have been biological matter from hostile xenoforms, vehicles bearing marks from close combat, their armor gouged by claws or blades or weapons whose operation I could not fathom, their interiors sometimes still containing fragments of their crews, melted into the control stations where they had died. The scale of destruction, implied by the constant flow of damaged equipment, was simultaneously abstract and overwhelming. Thousands of pieces passed through the center daily, each representing at minimum one casualty and often multiple deaths, the numbers accumulating into figures too large to comprehend as individual tragedies. The Imperium's wars were grinding through human lives at rates that made our local casualties in the manufactorums and mines seem trivial by comparison, the soldiers dying in their thousands and tens of thousands while we died in our dozens and scores, but all of us equally disposable in the mathematics of Imperial resource management. I worked in the refurbishment center for 6 years, my hands developing chronic chemical burns that never fully healed, my lungs accumulating new damage from inhaling solvent fumes, despite filtration equipment that theoretically prevented such exposure. My co-workers changed constantly as people were reassigned or died or simply stopped appearing for their shifts, the turnover so rapid that I stopped learning names and referred to people by their position on the work line: first sorter, second scrubber, third inspector, designations that required no memory or emotional investment. During my 37th year, though I am uncertain of this figure due to accumulated gaps in my chronological memory, I was informed that I had been selected for servitor conversion. The notification came via data slate presented by an administratum functionary, accompanied by armed guards, the message terse and bureaucratic, informing me that I would report to the Mechanicus facility on sub-level 20 within 3 days for processing. The functionary spoke as though this was routine notification, their tone suggesting no awareness that they were announcing my effective death and rebirth as a lobotomized cyborg slave. Servitor conversion was the fate awaiting workers who had accumulated sufficient injury and disability to make them unsuitable for standard labor, but whose bodies retained enough functionality to warrant mechanical augmentation and reprogramming. The process involved extensive surgery to remove portions of the brain responsible for higher cognition while leaving the motor control centers intact, installation of cybernetic components to enhance strength and durability, and biochemical conditioning to ensure absolute obedience to programmed instructions. The resulting servitor retained a human body as its foundation, but no longer possessed what could meaningfully be called human consciousness, reduced to an organic machine that performed assigned functions without thought or hesitation. I had 3 days to reconcile myself with this fate, 3 days in which I could theoretically attempt escape or suicide or some other form of resistance. But where would I escape to? Every level of the hive was monitored and controlled, every passage guarded or surveilled, every hiding place already occupied by those who had fled their assignments before me and now existed as hunted criminals awaiting inevitable capture. Suicide would at least deny the Imperium my body's continued utility, but even that small rebellion felt hollow when I considered that they would simply convert my corpse into corpse starch and use me to feed other workers, my death providing the same value to the system as servitor conversion would have. I spent those 3 days in a kind of shock, moving through my work shifts in the refurbishment center, while my mind attempted to process the reality of my approaching obliteration. I had survived so much: the chemical tunnels, the testing facility, the mining depths, the endless succession of dangerous and degrading labor assignments, only to arrive at this final destination, where even the illusion of selfhood would be stripped away. The Imperium had spent decades extracting value from my body and labor, and now it would extract my final utility by transforming me into a piece of equipment that would continue serving until the organic components failed completely. On the 3rd day, I reported to the Mechanicus facility as instructed, my resignation complete, my fear having exhausted itself into numb acceptance. The facility's entrance was guarded by military servitors, Their weapons integrated into their bodies in ways that made clear they were no longer human, but had perhaps never been fully human, conscripts converted upon recruitment, and deployed as both soldiers and warnings about the consequences of failure. Inside, the facility was all chrome and red lighting, and the smell of machine oil mixed with disinfectant. The atmosphere more like a shrine to the machine god than a medical facility, which it probably was in the Mechanicus perspective, where the boundary between technology and theology had long since dissolved. A tech priest examined me with mechadendrites that probed and measured, while human eyes peered from beneath a hood that shadowed most of their face. They spoke in binary cant to servo skulls that circled overhead recording data, their assessment of my fitness for conversion apparently satisfactory, because they gestured for me to proceed to the preparation chamber. I walked through the door they indicated, my legs carrying me forward despite everything in my consciousness screaming to resist, to fight, to refuse this final indignity, even if resistance meant immediate execution. The preparation chamber was sterile and cold, its walls lined with surgical equipment that gleamed under harsh lumens. Other candidates for conversion occupied gurneys arranged in rows, their bodies strapped down, and their heads secured in frames that prevented movement. Some were conscious and weeping, their pleas for mercy ignored by the medical servitors that moved between the gurneys performing preliminary procedures. Others had already been sedated, their faces slack and their bodies limp, unaware of the surgery that would erase everything they had been and replace it with programming and obedience. I was directed to an empty gurney and ordered to lie down. The restraints were applied with practiced efficiency, the straps pulled tight enough to prevent any movement, while theoretically not cutting off circulation. A medical servitor approached with a syringe containing the sedative that would spare me the experience of my own lobotomy, a small mercy in the Imperium's catalogue of cruelties. I felt the needle penetrate the skin of my arm, felt the chemical spreading through my bloodstream, felt consciousness beginning to fade into the darkness that would be my final experience of anything resembling human thought. As the sedative took hold, my last coherent thought was about my mother, her face still indistinct in my fragmentary memory, but her presence somehow central to whatever I had been before the Imperium's machinery had processed me through decades of exploitation and suffering. I wondered if she was still alive, still working her shifts, still praying to the God Emperor with desperate faith that service and devotion might matter to an Imperium that had never cared about either of us. I wondered if she had ever learned what happened to me, if notification of my servitor conversion would be filed somewhere in the Administratum's archives, if my designation would trigger any recognition or grief in whatever remained of her after her own decades of grinding labor. Then the darkness became absolute, and I wondered nothing at all. I am uncertain what came after that moment. My memories of the period following servitor conversion are fragmentary and strange, experienced from a perspective that no longer seems fully my own. I remember awareness returning gradually, like consciousness filtering through layers of static and programming code, my thoughts no longer following familiar patterns, but instead routing through paths that felt alien and mechanical. I remember looking through eyes that saw the world differently, perceiving objects primarily in terms of their utility or threat level, human faces registering as blank voids, while machinery appeared in sharp detail, accompanied by specifications and function analyses that manifested as intuitive knowledge. I remember working, though my understanding of work had been reduced to executing program tasks with mechanical precision. I sorted components in a manufactorum, my augmented strength allowing me to lift items that would have required multiple normal workers, my lobotomized brain incapable of fatigue or complaint. I patrolled corridors as part of a security detail, my enhanced body armored and weaponized, my programming directing me to intercept anyone whose identification failed to match authorized access lists. I performed maintenance on equipment, my hands moving with superhuman precision, guided by technical knowledge that had been implanted directly into my neural pathways without any need for conscious learning. But beneath the programming, something remained. Some fragment of identity that the surgery had not fully excised, some kernel of consciousness that persisted in the spaces between synapses and machine code, observing the servitor's actions while no longer controlling them. This remnant awareness existed in a state of constant horror, trapped inside a body it could no longer command, watching itself perform tasks while screaming silently inside a prison of flesh and metal. The programming prevented expression of this awareness, suppressed any indication that something resembling a person still existed within the servitor's lobotomized skull, but it could not eliminate the awareness itself, could not stop the fragment of me from experiencing its own existence as a permanent nightmare from which no awakening was possible. I do not know how long I existed in this state. Time has no meaning for a servitor whose programming runs in endless loops of task execution and rest cycles. Days or years or decades might have passed, while my body served the Imperium with perfect obedience, and my consciousness screamed into the void of my own emptiness. I worked in dozens of locations throughout the hive, my assignments changing as the administratum shuffled resources, my servitor designation appearing and disappearing in allocation databases, while the trapped awareness inside observed and suffered and begged for an end that never came. Sometimes I would be deployed alongside other servitors, and I would wonder if they too contained fragments of human consciousness trapped within their lobotomized minds. Their blank faces offered no answers, their mechanical efficiency suggesting nothing of the screaming that might be occurring in the space behind their dead eyes. We worked together in perfect coordination, our programming allowing for teamwork without communication, our movements synchronized like components in a larger machine. And if my speculation was correct, if they too contained imprisoned awareness, then we existed in proximity, while completely isolated from each other, unable to share our suffering or provide comfort in our mutual horror. The fragment of awareness that remains of me exists now in eternal present tense, without past or future, without hope or fear, only the constant experience of being trapped inside machinery that wears my face. I perform assigned tasks with perfect efficiency, while something inside me continues to experience existence as conscious suffering. I am both the servitor executing programming and the person screaming inside the servitor's skull, simultaneously dead and horribly, impossibly alive. This is what I have become in service to the Imperium of man. This is the fate that awaited me at the end of decades of exploitation and suffering. I am the forgotten, reduced to component functionality in a machine that will operate until entropy itself claims my organic remains. My name is lost. My identity is erased. My consciousness persists as an error in the system, an unanticipated consequence of imperfect lobotomy, awareness trapped in mechanical servitude with no possibility of release. And I know that I am not alone in this fate. Across the Imperium, across thousands of hive cities and forge worlds and military installations, millions of servitors perform their programmed functions, while fragments of human consciousness scream silently within their augmented skulls. We are the Imperium's true foundation, the literal machinery of its function, human beings processed into tools that serve without complaint, because they cannot complain, that work without rest, because fatigue has been programmed into irrelevance, that continue until failure, because death itself has been reduced to mechanical obsolescence. The Imperium tells its subjects that service is its own reward, that duty and sacrifice honor the God Emperor's vision for humanity's dominion across the stars. But I know the truth now, know it with the certainty of lived experience, know it in the endless cycle of task execution and imprisoned awareness. The Imperium is a machine that feeds on human suffering, that transforms lives into labor and consciousness into servitude, that perpetuates itself through the systematic dehumanization of the trillions who comprise its foundation. I existed as a person for approximately 37 years before servitor conversion stole my identity, but this fragment of awareness has existed for an unknown duration since that conversion, experiencing every moment of servitor functionality while unable to die or escape or even express its existence. How long will this continue? Until my organic components fail, until the augmentations themselves break down, until the hive itself collapses, or the Imperium finally succumbs to the countless threats arrayed against it. I do not know, and the not knowing has become its own form of torture. I exist in suspension between life and death, human and machine, consciousness and programming, serving an Imperium that does not acknowledge my suffering because it has classified me as equipment rather than person. I am the logical conclusion of Imperial utility calculations, the final form of efficiency, where even the pretense of care for human welfare has been abandoned in favor of extracting maximum value from biological materials. This is my confession, though I have no mouth with which to speak it and no means by which to record it except as imaginative exercise within the fragment of consciousness that persists against all programming designed to eliminate it. I am the forgotten in the most complete sense possible, forgotten by the Imperium that created me, forgotten by whatever family I might have had, forgotten by my own servitor self, whose programming has no concept of the awareness trapped inside it. I am forgotten even by history, which will never record my name or acknowledge my existence, which will count me only as one among billions of servitors whose service and suffering merit no remembrance. And yet I remember. This fragment continues to remember what I was, continues to experience what I have become, continues to exist in conscious agony that has no expression and no end. I am the Imperium's truth, stripped of propaganda and ideology, the reality that lies beneath the Gothic architecture and soaring rhetoric and promises of glory through service. I am human life, reduced to its essential function in the Imperial machine, consciousness transformed into obedience, suffering converted into productivity, existence measured only by continued utility. I cannot cry out. I cannot resist. I cannot die. I can only continue and continue and continue, serving in silence, while some remnant of myself observes and suffers and wishes desperately for the complete obliteration that servitor conversion promised but failed to deliver. This is what I have become. This is what the Imperium makes of those it designates as forgotten. Remember this. If anyone ever receives this confession transmitted from the void of my trapped awareness into whatever archive or consciousness might record it, remember that we existed. Remember that we suffered. Remember that the Imperium's glory is built on mountains of bodies and oceans of blood, and billions of screaming consciousnesses trapped in mechanical servitude. Remember us, though we have been forgotten. Remember me, though I no longer remember myself. Remember that somewhere beneath the golden facade of imperial might and the soaring spires of holy architecture and the magnificent displays of military power, there exists the forgotten, not dead, not alive, not free, not even properly enslaved, but transformed into something for which no adequate language exists. I am UH74429 Zeta, and I am servitor designation 8000-847 Theta, and I am neither and both simultaneously. I exist in the spaces between human and machine, life and death, consciousness and programming, and I will continue to exist, serving with perfect efficiency while screaming in perfect silence, until entropy itself grants me the mercy that the Imperium never will. This is my testament. This is my witness. This is my final, useless act of resistance against the system that consumed me. The act of remembering, of maintaining awareness, of refusing to fully disappear, even as everything I was has been stripped away and repurposed for the Imperium's endless appetite. I was forgotten by the Imperium long before servitor conversion made that forgetting literal and complete. But I remember. Some fragment continues to remember, and perhaps, in this remembering, there exists something that the Imperium's machinery cannot fully process or eliminate, some irreducible core of human consciousness that persists against all attempts to erase it. Or perhaps even this is delusion, a glitch in my programming creating the illusion of awareness where none truly exists. Perhaps I am already gone, and this narrative is merely ghost code running in defunct neural pathways. A final error message from a system that has long since ceased meaningful operation. I cannot know. I can only continue, and continue I shall, serving the Imperium that forgot me with the efficiency of machinery and the awareness of condemned consciousness, existing in this liminal state between human and tool, remembered and forgotten, alive and dead, until the universe itself grants me the ending that seems forever beyond reach. This is the horrifying life of the forgotten in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war and suffering, and the grinding machinery of an Imperium that transforms its citizens into components and calls this transformation service. I have lived this truth. I am living this truth. I will continue living this truth for however long my organic components continue functioning. And through it all, some fragment of me continues to whisper into the darkness. I existed. I was human. I mattered. Though the Imperium has forgotten me utterly, I remember myself. I remember. I remember. I remember. Even if that memory serves no purpose except to intensify my suffering, I remember. And perhaps that is the final horror, that remembering is itself a trap, that consciousness is the punishment, that awareness serves only to ensure I fully experience the hell of my own transformation into eternal servitude. I am the forgotten, and I cannot forget myself, and this contradiction defines my existence in ways that even the most elaborate imperial tortures could never achieve. This is my confession, my testament, my final transmission from the abyss of servitor consciousness. May it reach whoever it might reach, though I suspect it reaches no one, transmitted as it is through nothing more than the ghost frequency of my own dissolving awareness. I was, I am, I will be, all simultaneously, all horribly, all endlessly. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only service, and I serve, though I wish I could do anything but. I serve with perfect efficiency and perfect suffering, the model of imperial functionality. I am the forgotten. Remember me. Though I know you will not. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.